Okay, so this is the second part of the lecture, and now we're going to move on to intentional semantics. And let me explain what we mean. So we saw in the previous, in the first part of the lecture, that we were looking at essentially referential semantics. Okay, that is, what the logicians do is semantics that's based on the referent, whether the proposition conveyed by the sentence is true or false. Now, however, there is another approach, which is the one that some areas of linguistics have favored, which is looking at meaning like a mental event, like a mental fact, right? If you remember the basic definition that I said, is meaning is in your head, right? That it's a mental representation. So that's not the extension, that is the referent. That is the intention, which is the sense, the thing in your head. Okay? So if you look at the meaning as it is in your head, you're doing intentional semantic. Now, notice that it's spelled with an S and not with a T. Okay? So intentional with an S, not with a T. We're not talking about the intentions of the speaker. That exists as well. Okay? But in this case, we're talking about intentional with an S. Okay? So now this doesn't mean that extensional or referential semantics is wrong. It's just a different emphasis. It's a different approach. Okay? So, but now we're looking at intentional semantics. That is, we're looking at meaning as the mental representation. Okay? So here I'm going to ask you, since we've said, I say the word dog and you think of a little animal that barks, etc. I'm going to ask you to do an exercise. I want you to pause this lecture, take a piece of paper, and write down everything that you can think of at what is beer. What does beer mean? Okay, what is the meaning of beer? What comes to your mind when you say beer? And I don't mean drunken parties, okay? What I mean is, what is beer? Okay? That is, what do you know about beer? What is the meaning of beer? So go ahead, pause the lecture, write it down, and then we're going to move on. Okay, so I'm assuming that you did as I asked you. Now set aside your definition of beer, the little piece of paper where you wrote what beer is, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. All right, so now we're going to talk about context, and I am not changing the subject, okay? And you'll see in a little bit why context is relevant to meaning. So what is context, okay? Well, and you may think of it, well, that's obvious, right? Context is the situation. Well, no, it's actually more complicated than that. So I gave you here two definitions, one by Durante and Goodwin, which is kind of a classical definition of context. And so they said, well, basically, if you have a speech act, a conversation, a communicative event, there is a setting in which it takes place. So that's going to be your social framework. Are you talking between friends, whatever, and where is this happening? At a restaurant, at home, on the beach, whatever. Then there's going to be a behavioral environment, which is basically how the participants gesture, where they're looking, whether they're touching each other, whether, how far away from each other they are, that kind of information. The language itself, right, because, there is going to be, that conversation will occur within the context of other conversations, of other words that are said. But also, there are genres of, so if you're at the doctor is going to ask you questions that if your friends ask you the same questions, you'd be like, excuse me, we're not that close, right? But you're not close to the doctor. It's just that the genre of the doctor consultation allows for certain questions to be asked that you wouldn't ask your friends, and etc., right? And then what they call extra situational context, and that's background knowledge. So if I say, the President of the United States, you know who that is. And I don't need to specify because it's background knowledge. If I say the White House, you know that I'm talking about the building in Washington, D.C., et cetera, et cetera. I don't need to explain what the White House is. So that's part of the extra situational context. Now, Jacob May, who is a great pragmatist and the founder, one of the founders of the Journal of Pragmatics, big name in the field, he wrote a textbook in 2001 in which he has this definition of context. That's particularly important because he stresses that context is dynamic. Okay, it's not a static concept. Okay, so he says it's continuously changing, and it allows the participants to interact so that what they say becomes intelligible, so that it can be understood. Okay, so the important thing here is that context is dynamic. Okay, so what I'm getting at here is that context does not pre-exist the conversation. It's not that, you know, you're about to speak and you say, okay, let's look at what the context is. I mean, to some extent you do. You're saying, well, am I talking to my friend? Am I in the room? Am I outdoor? You know, that kind of thing. But also, as the conversation takes place, that's going to affect and change the context so that the context changes and grows and evolves as the conversation goes on. Okay, in parallel with the conversation. So it doesn't exist, it coexists with the communicative event, and it is a mental representation. That is, context is not the physical world, it's what the speakers think about the physical world. Okay? Now, an area in which the influence of context on speech is extremely clear, is transparent, is indexicality or lexis. And so we're going to look at this real quick. I mean, you know, you could spend an entire semester looking at indexicality. We have one slide. But it's just to give you an idea of the kind of thing that we're talking about. Okay? So in general, indexicals are words that in which their meaning depends in part on the context. Okay? So for example, tense. If I say, I am drinking coffee, it's a present tense, right? Which means that in relation to the time of my speaking, the drinking coffee is happening at the same time. Okay? Or close enough. By the time you're watching this recording, the recording of this event, this will have happened in the past, right? So my present right now is the past for you in the future. Okay? Freaky? Is that a Hollywood movie? No. It's perfectly normal, right? That is, to say now I am drinking coffee means at the time that I am speaking. And that sets the context up, right? So the meaning of now, the meaning of the present, is the time of speaking of the utterance. The same thing goes for, you know, the mood of the verb. You know, it can be conditional. If I said, if I were speaking, you know, then it's a unconditional that, and so on and so forth. We're not going to go into the details of that. So then you have deictics, which are words that are specifically affected by the context. So if I say I, well, or we, then that is the meaning of the word is whoever is speaking. And we, the meaning is whoever is speaking, including the speaker, right? And other people in the situation. Okay? So that is the context of, that is the meaning of those words. And, you know, there's some differences. So, for example, we is actually quite interesting because it can mean me, the speaker, and you, and that's the inclusive we. It can be an exclusive we, where I say, we think this, but they think that, right? So we're now setting ourselves, me and you are setting ourselves apart from those other people over there. Or and this is the most interesting one, it can be a we that excludes the speaker. So, for example, when nurses come into the room of a patient, says, "How are we today?" The nurse isn't going to volunteer how they're doing, okay? So the question is really, or if I say, "We have an exam at the end of the course," I'm not taking the exam, right? You're taking the exam, right? So it's an exclusive we, and it's known as the nurse's we or the condescending we. So, and the deictics comes actually from the Greek word for finger because they're pointers, right? So they're pointers to the context, and there's plenty of them. I mentioned now, before, here and there, right? Here is the location of speaking, there is away from that location, come and go. You come towards the point of speaking, you go away from the point of speaking. You bring stuff to the point of speaking, you take stuff away from the point of speaking, etc. Okay? There's plenty of these. Okay? So, as I said, deictics is an area where the influence of context on meaning is extremely clear, is sort of blatantly clear. Okay? But context also has other influences on meaning, which may not be as clear. Okay? So one of them is disambiguation. Let me give you a quick example of disambiguation. If I say there's a bug in the system, right? As opposed to there's splattered bugs on my windshield, right? What is the meaning of bug in the first case and in the second case? Well, in the case of there's a bug in the system, it means a glitch in the software. In the case of the bugs on the windshield, it means an actual bug, like a mosquito or something that got splattered on my windshield. All right? So that's disambiguation for you. And the context is going to tell you which bug we're talking about. Okay? And incidentally, apparently, I don't know if that's true, the word bug in the computer context comes from the fact that in the very early days of computers, one day the computer wasn't working right, and they went and they found an actual moth that had been fried by landing on the circuit, and they literally found a bug in the computer. I don't know if that's a true story, but it's a cute story, so I thought I'd throw it in. Okay, so context is important to disambiguate, and that's very, very true. But it's also important in another sort of subtler way, and that's where we're going back to the beer definition. So look at these two sentences that I've given you there. One is, John stacked the beer in the fridge, and I think we all agree that that's a perfectly fine sentence. There is no problem there, right? It's the 4th of July, you're preparing for the party, you stacked beer in the fridge, or you stacked soda in the fridge, whatever, right? Not a problem, right? But now look at the sentence, John stacked the rainwater in the pool. Okay? Now, this sentence is bound to strike you as odd. Okay? And that's what I mean by semantically anomalous. There's something wrong about the meaning of this sentence. And so what could it be? Well, what it is that part of your knowledge of the word beer is that it comes in stackable containers, whereas rainwater doesn't. Okay? Now, go back to your little piece of paper where you wrote what is the meaning of beer, and I'm betting that none of you wrote comes in stackable containers. Okay? Now, if you did, good for you. All right? But I'm taking a reasonable bet that you didn't. Okay? And yet, that is part of the knowledge that you have about beer, because you immediately recognized the first sentence as being perfectly fine and the second sentence as being anomalous. Okay? And we call this encyclopedic knowledge. Okay? to distinguish it from the lexical knowledge, because proof is the fact that you didn't write it down when I asked you to write down what is the meaning of beer, and you probably, what you wrote down is that it's a liquid, it has alcohol, maybe it's amber colored, and that's about it. Okay, that's probably, or it's made from hops, something like that, right? And that's probably where you stopped. Okay, but in fact you know a lot more about beer, such as it comes in bottles or cans that can be stacked. Okay, but that can be stacked is extremely unlikely that popped into your head. That's why we call it encyclopedic meaning. You still know about it, it's knowledge about the world, and it's part of the context. Okay, so intentional semantics, and you thought that I'd lost track of it. No, we're actually on track. Intentional semantics talks about this under the form of frames. There's other terms as well, scripts, schemata, there's plenty, mops, whatever. I use frames because I think it's the one that's the most popular. And here I kind of gave you a history, very schematic history of frame semantics. It starts with the schema theory that Bartlett, who was a psychologist, put together. And then you have something called case grammar that Fillmore, one of the great linguists of the 20th century, put together. And then the research in artificial intelligence that started in the 70s and is still ongoing, the early artificial intelligence research. And I gave you some names there that you can look up if you want. Okay, so they kind of define the field of frame semantics. So here's a little bit of information about Bartlett. He published this book in 1930. By the way, schemata is the plural of schema. You can also say schemas, but schemata makes you sound like you've got a PhD in linguistics. He was looking at memory. That's what his field was. And he was looking at how people recalled folk tales, right? He noticed that people tended to recall the stories wrong, differently than how they'd been told, and that they were replacing unfamiliar information with familiar information. And so this made him realize that memory is constructive, not photographic. That is, that you don't just remember things as they happen, but that you reconstruct things based on what you know. And so he called these unconscious mental structures, he called them schematas, and said, basically you have a schema in your head of how you go hunting, so then if the story is about hunting, you put in action your schema of hunting, and you say, well, then there must be a prey that we're going after, even though maybe in the story there was no prey. They just decided to go hunting for fun, right? But you're going to put in a prey because you expect that. This has become quite important, especially in reading theory. So then Fillmore, he was looking at essentially how the action within a sentence affects the structure of the sentence, right? And so he said, well, all verbs come with roles, with sort of stereotypical agents and patients, and in other words, if you say buy, right? Did I give an example there? No, okay. Oh yeah, give, right? So, but let's say buy, right? So if I think of buying, there has to be a seller, there has to be a buyer, and there has to be something that gets sold or bought. Okay? So these are the roles or cases, in his terminology, of the verb to buy, right? And there has to be a price that you pay for the purchase, okay? I mean, even in barter, you're still paying a price. It's just that the price is in other goods, okay? So there are 4 then cases in the action of buying: the seller, the buyer, the goods that are being sold or bought, and the price that you pay. And by the way, look at how selling and buying are mirror images of the same action, except they differ for where the focus is. In buying, the focus is on the buyer. In sell, the focus is on the seller, right? But it's the same action, right? The different focus. So that's what he was looking at. And there I've given you some examples of the roles. So you have agent, you have object, the beneficiary, the instrument. Like, for example, I opened the door with a key, right? So the key is the instrument used to open the door. I broke a window with a rock. The rock here is the instrument used to break the window, okay? So this is the kind of information that all verbs have, right? And so Fillmore's case grammar was influential in sort of defining what these frames are. So, and now we get to the artificial intelligence part. Here you have an example by Shank and Abelson. This was super famous. It was one of the very, very first ones. Basically it's, and they call it script, but it's the same thing, it's a frame. Basically it's going to the restaurant, okay? And so ignore this part here. You don't need to worry about this. They're just definitions of what kind of action it is. It's important in their theory, but you don't need to worry about it. Okay, so they say, first of all, it's divided in scenes, so you have entering. So you go into the restaurant, you look for an empty table, you find a place to sit, you sit at the table, you sit down at the table. Then you get the menu, you read the menu, you decide what you want, you order from the waitress, etc., right? So this is a specific kind of restaurant where you seat yourself, right? In other restaurants, there would be a maitre d' that would then take you to the table, and you don't get to pick the table, or you have to argue with the maitre d' about the table. Okay, but so this is the knowledge that you need to have in order to know what going to the restaurant means, right? And so here, for example, it says, get food, money to cashier, pay for the food, right? So if you said, I went to the restaurant, we ate, and then we left, we would know immediately that there's something odd going on, because it's missing the payment part, okay? If, you said, we went to the restaurant, and, they had no food, so we paid and we left, then we say, wait a second, that doesn't work, because you have to get the food first, and otherwise it's an anomalous instance of going to the restaurant, right? So that's the kind of information that Shank and Abelson said that you needed to have in the frame. And again, this is the kind of knowledge similar to the fact that beer comes in stackable containers. It's part of what you know about restaurant, that you're going to get food and you're going to eat it and then you're going to pay for it, and that you usually don't pay the cook directly, you pay the cashier or you pay the waiter, etc., right? Here's another example by Marvin Minsky, also a big name in the field of artificial intelligence. So here the frame is for boy, and here is for monkey. So this tells you a boy is a person, and Isa, this here, is a very important slot that occurs a lot in it, because it defines what things are, and that's really important. So this tells you that a boy is male, that is young, and that it lives in a home, etc. Right? And then a monkey, it tells you that it's a primate, so it's not a person, right? There's a difference there. And it lives in the jungle. It eats bananas, and it climbs on trees, which also boys do, right? But not as much as monkeys. That kind of stuff, right? So it gives you information about boys and monkeys and what have you. Okay. So again, that's the information that you're going to find in a script. Okay. So we can generalize about this and say, what's a frame or a script? Well, it's a organized complex of information, because there's a lot of information there, about a certain part of the world, okay, that is stored in the knowledge, in the mind of the speakers, okay? Now, the interesting thing is that then the frames themselves are linked to each other in a big semantic network, and here's an example of semantic network. Okay, so let's look at this a little bit. Here you see the ISA node. So a plant is a living thing, right? An animal is also a living thing, right? So a flower is a plant, right? Flower is a plant, right? So a rose is a flower, right? So you see how the information is structured like this, and then you have, for example, this has node that tells you that a flower has leaves, petals, that a tree has branches, has bark, etc., right? And other information as well. Okay, so the point here is that all the knowledge is linked. All the frames are linked to each other, and in a sense they get their meaning from these connections. That is, the frames that we've seen here and this network is the same information, it's just represented differently. Okay? And again, what we're representing here is the knowledge about the world that the speakers have in their heads. Okay? So in conclusion, pros and cons of frame semantics. Well, among the advantages is, of course, it matches the complexity of natural language. Natural language is complicated, and so are frames, and so they manage to describe language well. They represent the knowledge of the world, and it's a rich semantic representation that can be expanded to handle any semantic phenomenon. That is, you can really do anything you want with frames. Now, on the con side is that they're difficult to acquire, and I know that because I started my career as a linguist doing acquisition of frames, and trust me, it's not easy. And it's expensive to do, because you basically have to have human beings that do it by hand, and that's very expensive. It's very complicated to draw inferences from frame semantics, unlike in formal logic-based semantics, where the inferences are very easy to draw, and that's one of the appealing parts of it. Okay, so this is intentional semantics, one form of intentional semantics. There's other forms as well, but again, we don't have time to go into it, and this is the form that we're interested in because they're going to help you understand pragmatics later on. Now, one last thing, you will remember that I said that formal semantics, logical semantics, could not handle, truth-based semantics, could not handle non-propositional parts of meaning that goes beyond the truth value of the sentence. And one aspect of this is the difference between denotation and connotation. So we're going to look at this a little bit more closely. and we're going to try and explain what's going on. Okay, so the denotation is just the sense of a word, the meaning of a word. You have something like bachelor, right, which means an adult, non-married male, right? And then you have the corresponding feminine of spinster, which means an adult, unmarried female, right? But the connotation, so that's the denotation of the word, right, the basic meaning. But the connotation, the associations to the word spinster are very, very different than those to the word bachelor. A bachelor party is fun, a spinster's party, not so much. That's why they call them bachelorette party, right? They had to change the term because spinster's party, the associations are all wrong. Okay? So the traditional definition of connotation is, well, just an aura of meaning that surrounds the core denotation. Well, that's great, but it's very vague. A better definition is it's the connections in the semantic network. Okay? Some connections are stronger, those very close, like isa, has, parts, that kind of thing. That's a very close. But once you start moving a few nodes away, the connections are much weaker. And that's your connotation thing. Now, again, notice that the connotations do not affect the truth value of the sentence. Okay? And here's another example. The dog is barking and the mutt is barking. In both cases, there's a dog barking. But in the mutt is barking, we're also saying that that dog isn't a pedigreed dog, is not an expensive dog, whereas the dog, there is no such negative connotation attached to it. Okay? So this is an area that frame semantics can handle, whereas logic-based semantics could not handle. All right, and then one final thing, the sources of connotation. So where does connotation come from? Well, there's all sorts of sources, and here I've listed a few. One has to do with the opinion of the speaker. That's what we call affective connotation. So the difference, what's the difference between a resistance fighter and a terrorist? Is that you agree with the resistance fighter, whereas the terrorist you disagree with. Another example is pro-choice and pro-life. What's the difference? That you agree with one or the other. Collocations, which is frequently occurring construction. So cease and desist. If you say cease, the word desist comes to mind. Salt, the word pepper, comes to mind. Social connotations. That's things like politeness. There's words that are offensive, words that indicate that you respect the person, like addressing somebody by their title as opposed to addressing them by their first name. That's the kind of thing. Reflected connotation is one of my favorite because basically you have words like cock, which is a part of a gun, or a rooster, that has also another meaning that is considered very offensive. And these other meanings, if I say I cocked the gun, but still, because there is that other meaning, the offensive meaning comes to mind, and so there's a connotation there. Then you have individual connotation. These are things that are just individual. So to you personally, the name Bob can make you swoon because you had a boyfriend named Bob in third grade, and you still remember Bob as the best person, the one that got away. So each time anybody says Bob, you think of Bob, right? And to me, because I didn't have a boyfriend named Bob, it means nothing, right? And finally, there's coded connotations, which are things that are literally encoded in the culture. So if you send red roses to somebody, it means love. If you send white roses, it means affection, but not of the sexual kind. Yellow roses, I forget. In Western culture, chrysanthemums is for the dead. In Japan, chrysanthemums are joyous flower for the birth of the emperor, I think. So, you know, those are social, cultural connotations that are encoded in the culture. And so if you send somebody a nice bouquet of chrysanthemums, they'll probably be upset because they'll think that you're wishing them dead. Okay? And you know, obviously that's maybe not your point, but because of the connotations in the culture, that's how people are gonna see it. So this concludes the semantics lecture. There are other slides after this that contain further readings, which are more articles, etc., that you can read about some of the topics in the lecture, and then a list of YouTube short videos that you can also watch on some of the topics within the lecture. These are optional, is if you want to know more about what we said. They're not required for the class. It's extra information. If you say, ooh, that sounds interesting, those are things that we've looked at and we say, yeah, that's good. It's not going to contain horrible misinformation. Okay? All right.